October is finally here, and you know what that means. That's right, it's Danny Phantom month, the month where I make videos about Danny Phantom. This year, we're gonna do something a little bit different. Every day, or almost every day, I'm gonna be reviewing a different episode of the first season of the show. Today's episode is the pilot of the show, episode 1, entitled Mystery Meat. So what is the story of this episode? We get a brief introduction of our main characters, Danny and his friends Tucker and Sam, as well as his relationship with his parents and his family, and we get to see a little bit of the dynamic of how he has to hide his ghost powers because his parents are ghost hunters. And then the main plot starts when we get to school. Sam has convinced the school board to introduce a new vegetarian menu to the school cafeteria, and the plot kind of unfolds from there. What I like a lot about this episode right off the bat is there's sort of two main conflicts that are both spread from the same initiating event, the new vegetarian menu. This introduces us to the first villain of the series, the lunch lady, who's just a ghost of presumably a former lunch lady at the school, and she's like really upset that they changed the menu, so she like attacks everyone with meat. And then the other main conflict is how everyone kind of hates this new menu, and how, because Sam is Danny's friend, this affects his social life. Dash is mad at him, Lancer is mad at him, and this causes conflict within their friend group. So all these different conflicts all flowing from the same event, which is really strong storytelling and makes for a good TV show. Even though there's like distinct A and B stories, they still feel very connected. There's also a subplot about Danny's family, because we have to introduce them as characters as well, since they're main recurring characters for the series. His parents are too dumb to realize that Danny is clearly a ghost, but they do think there is a ghost somewhere, and so for whatever reason they think it's his sister Jazz. This subplot is pretty separate until the end of the episode, where it ends up paying off with the use of the Fenton thermos. This is a plot device that the show uses a lot. This episode will help us kind of break down the formula of the show, which is number 1, the ghost appears, which causes Danny to use his powers to fight it, which then causes Danny to have some kind of conflict with his normal life. Meanwhile, at the beginning of the episode, Danny's father, Jack Fenton, invents some new ghost hunting equipment that he can't figure out how to use. Conflict happens, and then at the end of the episode, Danny, or potentially one of his friends, figures out how to use the ghost hunting equipment and uses it to defeat the ghost, and then he finds a way to solve his everyday problem. And that's basically the formula for the show in a nutshell. This episode sometimes feels like it jumps around a lot because they're trying to introduce a lot of different characters. For example, there's a scene like early on at his house that introduces the dynamic between Jazz, who is really concerned that her parents are ghost hunters, which she thinks is fucking crazy, because of course she does. She's really concerned for both her own sanity and her younger brother Danny, and she just wishes that they had normal parents. On top of that, Danny's trying to hide his powers from his parents, and he's not sure if he should tell them or not. He's also worried that if he does tell them, they'll try to hunt him down because they're obsessed with hunting ghosts, and it's this really fun dynamic. And then we can move completely away from that to go to his school, which is this whole story with the lunch lady and the meat, and Tucker really likes meat, and Sam really likes veggies, and they conflict. And then we meet Dash, then we meet Lancer. We see how those characters interact with Danny, and it sort of seems like there's a lot going on, but it does all end up kind of tying together by the end. Although the show's pacing improves much more as it goes on, this episode is still really solid, and it does a good job as a pilot to introduce these characters, as well as it's really funny. They brought their A game with their jokes in this episode, and there's just a lot of like really great ones. I wrote down some that I thought were my favorite. At the beginning of the episode, Jack is droning on about his life, and at one point he says, "We had to eat horse meat that was back during the war," and they don't like address which war it was or anything. It's just like a weird, funny line. The introduction of Dash is amazing. Dash is obviously one of my favorite characters because he's basically Flash Thompson from the Spider-Man series, but dialed up to 11. What I really love about this show is it does stuff like this with these characters where they're really over exaggerated, but because of that, it almost like feels more realistic in a weird way, because the characters are like really self-aware about their stereotypes, so they just kind of play those up and like address like exactly what those stereotypes are feeling in a way that like is actually like pretty accurate. So like with Dash's like introduction, he says, "These are the best years of my life. After high school, it's all downhill for me," which is great because he knows that he's gonna peak in high school, and so he doesn't want to waste any of that time being forced to eat veggies at the cafeteria. Later when we introduce like Lancer, Danny's like, "Hey, Dash started it, he threw," and then Lancer cuts him off and says 4 touchdown passes in the last quarter, which is like amazing. It's just like really funny how self-aware the show is about its setting and its stereotypical characters. Even the teachers are like, yeah, we're gonna let him get away with more because he wins football games for our school. It just helps to make Danny feel more of an underdog because like not even the teachers are on his side. I also really like this trope that they introduced with Lancer where like whenever he's like surprised by something, he always exclaims famous book titles that are all like books that you're forced to read in high school. So that's something I'll try to keep up with every episode. The book of today's episode is Paradise Lost, which of course is when all the meat has been taken from the teacher's all-steak buffet in the teacher lounge, which is like another minor subplot that's brought about from the same event of the new veggie menu. Just like an ongoing joke, really, but because it comes from the same thing, and it makes everything feel connected in an organic way. And then at the end of the episode, they do a really good job summarizing the themes of the show, where Danny says, "I think I finally figured out what these powers are for. They make me," and then Lancer cuts him off again and says, "in a world of trouble." And that's the theme of the show right there. Danny tries to use his powers to help people, but it always ends up getting him in trouble with his personal life. The Tucker and Sam subplot in this episode is a little weak. That's kind of my only like real flaw with it. It's more played for comedy, where in like later episodes they do actually kind of like flesh out those characters more and give them a little more to do. Not as much as Danny or some of the other characters, but in this one they're pretty one-dimensional. Tucker is all about meat and Sam's all about being a ultra recycled vegetarian, which means that she doesn't eat anything with a face.
"I partake not in the meat, nor the breast milk, nor the ovum of any creature with a face."
But that's mainly just to push the plot forward, and the episode's juggling a lot of characters already, so I can forgive it for this one. Ultimately, I think this is a really solid pilot. The show definitely figures out its formula and some of its character dynamics a little better later on. But this episode is really, really fun and is really well written. There's a lot of great, like really great jokes, as well as they do a lot of variation in the action to keep it fresh and interesting. They do a lot of dynamic shots and a lot of variety in the action. So yeah, other than a couple minor pacing things, this is a really strong pilot and a really solid introduction to the characters and the themes of the series. So yeah, that's about it. Tune in tomorrow where we tackle the second episode. Welcome back to Danny Phantom Month, the month where I make videos about Danny Phantom. Today we're talking about episode 2 of the first season, which is called One of a Kind. So the plot, Danny is doing poorly in one of his classes, so Sam suggests that they do a research project on the purple-backed gorilla that's in the town's zoo. Meanwhile, Danny is being hunted by Skulker, the Ghost Zone's greatest hunter. He's a pretty commonly recurring villain throughout the series. In this season, he's played by Matthew St. Patrick. He's only in a couple episodes, but then later on, whenever they wanted to use Skulker, which was quite often, they just got Keith Michael Richardson's to do it because he's got a deep voice, so if you need a villain, just get him to do it, I guess.
Why don't you tell Ted that just knowing he's out there thinking about you, caring about you, makes you feel safe. So all your fears, all your yesterdays wash away, and only hope remains in the promise of his embrace.
We also introduce the Box Ghost in this episode, who's one of the best recurring characters of the series, who's just the lamest villain, and that's what's fun about him, is that he sucks. He's more of a nuisance than an actual like issue for Danny, which is fun. We also see, of course, the return of the Phantom Thermos from the last episode, and this, of course, is now a main item in the arsenal of Danny and his group of friends. There's a subplot about Jazz trying to get an article written about her mom in Genius Magazine, a genius magazine by women geniuses for women geniuses, to try to prove that her parents aren't crazy. There's a couple good jokes early on, but this doesn't really come into play all that much. Jack also invents the ghost gabber, which translates stuff that ghosts say. So Danny says like boo into it, and then it's like, I am a ghost, fear me. And they don't catch on because they're idiots. This doesn't really come back even within the episode all that much, and from my recollection they don't really do anything with it later. The main plot device of this episode is Tucker's PDA, which sort of dates the series a lot, as nobody uses PDAs, which stood for Personal Digital Assistant. I had to look that up because I completely forgot. No one uses those anymore, but it's the equivalent. It was the equivalent of a smartphone, more or less, just a little bit ahead of its time. And I don't know if you could call people on it. I can't remember. Some people did have them. I never did. But of course, Tucker is a big tech guy, and so that's like a big part of his character and will be used in many episodes later on. In this episode, Skulker uses it because his technology is so outdated that Tucker's PDA seems really advanced for him, so he plugs it into his battle suit. Then the like joke of the episode is that Skulker is now bound to follow the schedule that Tucker has set up in his PDA for Danny, so that Danny could learn more about this purple-backed gorilla. So the main conflict kind of becomes more comedic this episode, as every time that Skulker tries to like capture Danny, he ends up having to fly off to the library to check out a book on gorillas. It takes Danny way too long to figure that out, but I guess that's why he's a D student. But then once they do, they inevitably use that to defeat Skulker. We also see, for one of the only times in the series, that Skulker, who appears to be this big, like, muscular, threatening guy, is actually a tiny little ghost inside of a large battle mech suit thing. It's very Men in Black, and yeah, it's just kind of like, aha, you thought he was big and scary, but he's actually little and not scary. This is one of the only episodes that really goes into that and all. There's also some interesting inconsistencies I noticed with later on in the series. There's one scene where Skulker's like green flame hair is blue, and I don't know if that was just something that he can do sometimes, or if it was like a lighting thing, but I thought that was interesting. He also says that he's the ghost world's greatest hunter, where later on they call it the Ghost Zone. I think in the canon that's the name that Danny gives it, which is just like something he thought was cool sounding, I guess. But then they also like just have other ghosts that are from the Ghost Zone like refer to it as that, so I don't know. Fun fact, Butch Hartman, the creator of the series, wanted to originally call it the Phantom Zone, but of course he couldn't because DC Comics exists. So there you go. There's also a joke that like doesn't exactly age well, where Sam takes a photo of Danny and Tucker, who have fallen asleep kind of like cuddling, and she's like, aha, photos of boys hugging is always funny, and then she uses it to blackmail them later, and you see it's funny because gay. And yeah, you couldn't really do that joke now, so that's I don't want to like say that the show is problematic or anything, because they don't really go into that kind of thing at any other point that I can think of. It's just kind of one of those things where they didn't really think about that much, even all the way back in 2004, so yeah. The one line that I thought was really funny is there's a part where Skulker attacks a random kid in the library, and then Dash and like another jock see him and are like, did you do that? No, but I can always appreciate quality bullying, which is hilarious. Danny ends up learning enough about the gorilla to help for them to team up with the gorilla and fight Skulker in the end. Then he manages to discover that the gorilla is actually female, which earns him enough credit to move his mark up from a D to a C. One of the things I really like about Danny Phantom is that although he arguably comes from like a family of geniuses, Danny himself is not very smart, which again separates him from Peter Parker, making him even more of an underdog. Peter Parker at least got good grades and did well in school, but Danny doesn't. and I find it fun that that makes him even more of a loser and more of an underdog. So yeah, this episode isn't really anything too special, but it is important as it introduces both the Box Ghost and Skulker, who are some of the most recurring villains of the series. The Skulker having to fly away and check out a book on gorillas is funny enough for the episode, but it becomes more entertaining as they will often bring that joke back like much later on in the series. So this episode is more interesting in the fact that it introduces things that become staples of the series. And that's about it. Remember to come back tomorrow, we'll be watching episode 3. So, this is episode 3, which is called Parental Bonding. Story. The start of this episode, Jack Fenton invents the Fenton Fisher, which is just a fishing rod for ghosts, and when he leaves the room, Danny accidentally uses it to bring forth a dragon ghost, which turns out to just be a lady, and who has this amulet, and when you wear the amulet you turn into a dragon when you get angry. Later at the school, there's a school dance going on, and Danny and Tucker are trying to find dates. Here, I'm gonna turn my light on. I forgot about that. Ooh, look at that. You can actually see me now. Danny is interested in the popular girl Paulina, who Spectacular Spider-Man ripped off for their version of Liz Allen. But whenever he tries to talk to her, he can't control his ghost powers and ends up losing his pants. Sam tries to help him, which makes Paulina get the idea to make Sam jealous by asking Danny to the dance. Also, Danny finds out that he has a new power, which is the overshadow ability, which means that he can basically possess people and make them do whatever he wants. And also because he keeps losing his pants, Teacher Lancer is really concerned and wants to talk to his dad. Danny ends up overshadowing his dad, Jack, and talking to Lancer, giving him some vague excuse about how he's studying too hard, but because he has this new authority in an adult body, Lancer actually believes him. But then he asks Jack to chaperone the school dance. Also, while this is all happening, Danny does end up asking Paulina to the dance and gives her the amulet, which he then clues in is what's causing this dragon to keep appearing. While this is going on, Tucker's trying to ask out a variety of different girls to the dance, all of which are saying no to him. One of them is the character Valerie, who becomes much more important later on, but in this episode is just kind of another popular girl. In this one, she's just played by Greg Griffin. But later on, when they decide to make her a real character, she gets recast as Cree Summer, who plays every female black character in a cartoon. We also meet the character Quan, who's just another kind of jockey football guy, but he becomes a major recurring character as well. So then Tucker and Sam end up going to the dance together as friends. Sam, of course, is like, dances are dumb, I don't want to go, which is teenager for I'd like to go if someone asked me, but her two male friends don't even consider the idea of asking her, so she becomes jealous of Paulina. So then at the dance, Danny is going with Paulina, who has this cursed necklace that turns her into a dragon if she gets angry. His parents are going as chaperones, despite the fact that Jack doesn't remember having that conversation with Danny's teacher Lancer. And Sam and Tucker are going as friends to try to help Danny to get the amulet back. Danny gets distracted trying to overshadow his father so he can speak to Lancer and keep his story straight. So Sam ends up going to talk to Paulina to try to get the necklace back. Paulina does give it back to her when she realizes that Danny and Sam aren't actually dating, which was her whole reason for going to the dance with Danny in the first place, was just to steal him from Sam. So then Sam gets angry, and because she now has the amulet, she turns into a dragon and Danny has to fight her. He defeats her using the Fenton Fisher from the beginning of the episode, and at the end of the day, they decide that there's still enough time for one more dance, which is the ending of an episode in Spectacular Spider-Man. So that show also steals that idea. This is a really strong episode, and probably the best we've seen so far. This episode does a really good job balancing Danny's social life, his dynamic with his family, and his ghost fighting escapade. This episode also is really well paced and does a good job using all of the characters who all have distinct motivations and goals. Sam wants to go to the dance with Danny but won't say. Paulina wants to make Sam jealous. Danny wants to go to the dance with Paulina. Tucker wants to go to the dance with anyone. And Lancer is worried that Danny keeps losing his pants. This episode does a really good job using Tucker and Sam, who both have things to do in this episode, which is something that they sometimes struggle with later on. The high school dynamic is really fun in this one. There's a lot of really quick, good jokes with Dash where he's like talking to some girl being like, so, you like quarterbacks? And it's amazing. And we get a lot of things that become like important staples of the series. The first appearance of Paulina, Valerie, and Quan, who are all major supporting characters. Great use of the Fenton Fisher, which is one of the few gadgets that actually does come back quite often. And we get to see a new power from Danny, which of course is his overshadow ability. This is a really, really strong episode and does a really good job with the formula, as well as balancing all these characters and being funny and well written. And that's about it. So yeah, high recommend for this episode. Tune in tomorrow for where we take on episode 4. Alright, episode 4, Attack of the Killer Garage Sale. This one is a pretty average episode. Danny gets invited to Dash's big party because his sister Jazz is tutoring Dash and Dash has a crush on Jazz. So the conflict is that Danny keeps blowing off of his friends to try to make it with the popular crowd. He has to buy these like fancy clothes so that he fits in with the popular kids, so he ends up selling all of this old junk from his dad's garage, but all that old tech and technology and stuff ends up being haunted by Technus, the master of technology. He's just a ghost with technology powers, who is voiced by Rob Paulsen doing a Gilbert Gottfried impression. He's one of the most recurring villains, and he's really, really fun. Every time that they do bring him back, they always use him in a new way. We even get to see in this episode, he starts off as like this more scientist-looking ghost, and then by the end, he's controlling all this technology and makes himself this like giant robot body, which always reminded me of this one episode of the 2003 Ninja Turtles show where there's like these nanobots that turn into a robot in like a junkyard, and it's a really like sad and creepy episode. Anyway, by the time Danny gets to the party, Dash has already changed the dress code to specifically make fun of Danny and his friends. This is when Danny learns that high school parties are terrible and he shouldn't have blown off his friends. We get to learn a little more about Sam in this episode. Tucker and Sam go to her house and we find out that she's loaded. But of course, Sam is too cool to use her money to buy popularity. And she'd rather hang out with Danny and Tucker. At the end of the episode, Danny apologizes to his friends, who of course end up helping him defeat Technus. Tucker uses his knowledge of technology to hack Technus' system, and Sam uses her rich powers to order new software so that Tucker can do that. And then Danny learns a lesson about friendship. It's a pretty standard episode, but of course I love that the focus is on Danny's social life and real world problems. Sometimes with these episodes where Danny has to learn a lesson are really cheesy, but I also really enjoy them, so I can't really fault it too much. Fun episode, and obviously noteworthy for the inclusion of Technus, who becomes a main recurring villain. And is just really fun. There's this great moment where Sam's like, hey, I didn't catch your name. You should probably shout it really loudly along with your motivations. And then he's like, of course, I am Technus, master of technology. And it's hilarious and amazing. And that's about it. That's the end of the video. Welcome back to Danny Phantom Month. Today we're talking about episode 5, which is titled Splitting Images. The plot of this episode: after a fight with the box ghost, Danny needs a new locker, so he gets assigned locker 724, which is said to be cursed. And we find out that in the 50s there was a nerd called Sidney Poindexter who was bullied by everyone and was shoved in his locker so many times that his spirit is said to still remain, which is just hilarious. Just like taking the concept of a nerd getting shoved in his locker, which from my recollection of high school basically never happens, but I really like how the show plays with that stereotype, and especially in this episode with the locker is haunted because how often the nerd was shoved in there is really funny. So we find out Sidney Poindexter is a real ghost that lives inside the locker, and he basically exists to exact revenge on bullies. And throughout this episode, Danny has been like beating up Dash essentially and bullying him, using his powers to bully him. Which of course Sam is like, hey, that's pretty irresponsible, but Tucker's like, you know what, he kind of deserves it though, because he's been a dick. And I like this because this episode addresses this flaw of Danny's, which is something that he's done in the last couple episodes. It's a common trope at the end of the first few episodes where Danny will get some kind of revenge on Dash using his powers, which of course is like the thing in the theme song where he's much more unique than the other guy. But then again, like, two wrongs don't make a right and all that stuff. And this episode addresses that he's kind of becoming a bully himself. Just because he's bullying someone who arguably deserves it doesn't really make it right.
This guy, Flash Thompson, he probably deserved what happened. But just because you can beat him up doesn't give you the right to.
And so I like that this episode addresses that. So anyways, Poindexter thinks that Danny is straight up a bully, so he goes after him. They have a fight, and then Poindexter possesses Danny's body and traps Danny in Poindexter's body in the Ghost Zone. This is the first appearance of the Ghost Zone, and it's sort of kind of different than later on, but basically there's this like mirror in the locker that that acts as like a portal to the Ghost Zone, or at least the portion of the Ghost Zone that Poindexter is from, which is just like this kind of weird black and white 50s version of the school. And like there's all these other presumably ghosts of former students that went to the school. And then there's one point where Danny tries to go outside the school, and it's just floating in space. And later depictions of the Ghost Zone, we see that there's actually like a lot of stuff in it, and most of it is just like chunks of things randomly floating in space. So this does kind of fit into that. It's just a little bit strange because like everything's black and white, and you like assume that these are all like dead people that used to go to the school. But it's kind of fun because the 50s Ghost Zone even has like, it's almost like a Mr. Sandman riff playing.
Where am I? It's like I dropped into Grandpa Fenton's yearbook.
It's just like this kind of weird, fun idea. Sort of Back to the Future-ish, also very different. So then Poindexter in Danny's body befriends like Dash and the popular crowd, and there's this subplot about Sam trying to save the frogs from being dissected, which they seem to have live frogs at the school for some reason. But anyways, the point being that Poindexter's temporary popularity, Sam manages to get the popular kids invested in her Save the Frogs movement, which then pays off at the end when Lancer is like, you know, Sam, you could learn a thing or two from students like Dash about activism, and it's kind of great. Oh yeah, also Danny's parents had found out that he was assigned a supposedly haunted locker, so they're like, okay, we're coming to the school and we're gonna hunt that ghost. This episode we get the ghost gloves, which are just boxing gloves for ghosts, I guess. It's kind of unclear what makes them specific. I mean, I guess you can hurt ghosts with them. I guess that's the difference between just regular boxing gloves, but anyways. And then yeah, Tucker and Sam end up using that to force Poindexter back into the Ghost Zone. Poindexter and Danny have a fight, and then they switch bodies, and Danny manages to go back, make it back to the real world. But because Danny was in Poindexter's body, and Poindexter and Danny's in the Ghost Zone, when they have a fight, the rest of the like 50s greasers are like really impressed by Poindexter. And they're like, wow, you fought the Haffa, because they call Danny the Haffa, because he's half ghost and half kid. And so Poindexter ends up with like a newfound respect in the Ghost Zone. There's a joke about cross-dressing in this episode, which you could not make today, as well as the Lancer book report, which I'm not going to call the Lancer book report of this episode, was Great Gatsby, starring Leonardo DiCaprio and Seabiscuit. And that's about it. Danny learns a lesson about using his powers responsibly and how you shouldn't beat up people. Which is like something you think you would know already. But whatever, it's a fun little episode, and I like that they do address that Danny is like irresponsible with his powers in some of the previous episodes. And yeah, that's about it. A really great use of the high school location, and some fun world building with the Ghost Zone, the history of the school, and good episode. Tune in next week for... Nope, tune in tomorrow for the next episode. Welcome back to Danny Fandom Month. Today we are talking about episode 6, which is titled What You Want. So the plot of this one is There's a genie ghost who grants wishes called Desiree. Get it? Because it sounds like desire. And so she grants the wishes of various characters, and then they turn into like weird ghost versions of themselves, and then Danny has to fight them and pull a ghost out of them. And the main conflict is this episode is focused on Tucker, who becomes jealous of Danny because Danny's got all these cool powers and Tucker just has to sit on the sidelines and all that. So Tucker wishes that he also had ghost powers. Desiree grants him that wish, and then Tucker starts to abuse them, but then of course becomes like a dark version of himself, and eventually Danny and him have to fight. Danny finds out about Desiree and defeats her, ends up defeating her quite easily when he just wishes that she would go into his thermos, and then that works. So there you go. And then there's this great line where he says, man, if I weren't a C student, I would have thought of that 5 days ago, which is hilarious. And I, again, love that Danny is not that smart because it makes him more of an underdog and it makes things more of a challenge for him. So then Danny uses the Fenton Dreamcatcher, which is like a native dreamcatcher, but for ghosts. They introduced that at the beginning of the episode, and then at the end, Danny uses that to get the ghost out of Tucker. And then they apologize and make up. They're like, oh, I'm sorry that I was a show-off, and oh, I'm sorry that blah, 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 blah. And it's whatever. The Fenton Dreamcatcher is of note because it comes back into play in later episodes. Oh, also in this episode, this is the first one that uses Danny's Ghost Ray, which is just, he can shoot lasers out of his hands. Yep. And yeah, that becomes one of his main powers. This is a pretty whatever episode. There's this subplot about different characters getting sick. Sam has a cold, so she's in bed basically the whole episode, which I think is an excuse to have this contrived plot where Danny and Tucker are fighting, because if Sam was there, she would just tell them to stop and that would be the end of the episode. Also, there's kind of this weird narration with Tucker explaining like how he's jealous of Danny and stuff like that, and they don't do anything like that at all in any other episode that I can think. Actually, no, there might be an episode narrated by Jazz later on, but we'll get there. But yeah, it's kind of weird and not really necessary and makes the episode feel a little more contrived and weird. I think the problem is that this should be a good idea to have an episode focused on Tucker since he is one of the main characters, but the problem is that like once you get that, it's just like not that interesting. So there's a few kind of great moments in this one. Paulina gets turned into a version of Sayonara Pussycat, which is the show's version of Hello Kitty, which is really funny. There's an Easter egg in the background of that scene where you can see that there's a video game of Crash Nebula, who is like a Flash Gordon character from the Fairly Odd Parents. There's actually an episode of the Fairly Odd Parents that's like a whole like backdoor pilot of a Crash Nebula show that Butch Hartman was pitching at around the same time of Danny Phantom. And if you watch that episode, Crash Nebula, when which is about Crash Nebula as a teenager learning how to be a Flash Gordon space hero character. But if you watch that episode, there's a scene where he's reading a Danny Phantom comic book. So there you go, a little cross promotion. There's also a point when they're in Casper High and there's just a poster on the wall that says, "Read, don't be an idiot," which is amazing. And the Lancer book report for today is Gulliver's Travels starring Jack Black. That's about it. Not a whole lot to this episode other than introducing a couple things that do come back. Desiree, Danny's Ghost Ray, of course, one of his main powers, and the Fenton Dreamcatcher. But yeah, a fairly contrived plot with Tucker, which should be more interesting since he is one of the main characters, but it really just doesn't have a whole lot to it. And that's about it. Tune in tomorrow for another episode.
No man may lay a hand on me unless I wish it!
Yeah? How about a fist?
Welcome back to Danny Phantom Month. Today we are talking about episode 7 entitled Bitter Reunions. This is a really big and important episode, so let's just get right into it. At the beginning of the episode, Danny fights some mysterious Jewish vulture ghosts who have been sent to kill Jack Fenton. After the theme song, Jack decides to take his whole family to this college reunion that's held at his old buddy Vlad Master's castle that he owns. So this is the episode where we meet Vlad Master / Vlad Plasmius, who is the main villain of the series. He's Venom plus the Green Goblin. He has all of Danny's powers just like Venom. He's also a rich guy with a personal connection to Danny just like the Green Goblin is. And here's where we learn Vlad's origin. He used to be friends with Jack and Maddie in college, and they were working on a smaller version of the Ghost Portal, but something went wrong and Vlad ended up with ectoacne, which ruined his social life, and he was hospitalized and all this stuff. But it granted him ghost powers, the same ghost powers that Danny has. And then over the course of the last 20 years, he's figured out how to master his abilities, and he's used them for personal gain to become rich. So Vlad blames Jack for what happened to him and his chances at being with Maddie. And so we find out that he's actually sent the last few ghosts that Danny has fought to the Fenton's house in order to try to kill Jack. But what he didn't account for was, of course, Danny. In this episode, we get to see again the octopus ghosts from the first episode, as well as Skulker returns, which is really fun. And we get the callback to that gorilla joke where after Skulker like captures Danny in a fight, he's like, okay, now I have to go check out a book on gorillas. And this is another thing that I really like about this episode, is it really shows that actually, yes, there is continuity throughout this series. It's not just Villain of the Week. All of the stuff that happened is important, and we get to see a little bit more of that progression. So this episode basically just kind of explores the relationship between Vlad and Danny. Vlad is much more powerful than Danny, and so Danny can't really beat him in a one-on-one fight, which is cool because we get to see a variety of all these different powers that Vlad has that Danny doesn't even have yet. It's cool because it hints at further progression for where Danny is eventually going to go, as well as it gives him a main antagonist and a goal to work towards. The other cool thing about this is just the dynamics of all these different characters. Vlad wants Danny to work with him because he's like, oh, if we combined our powers, who knows what we could accomplish. It's very Green Goblin from the first Spider-Man.
There are 8 million people in this city.
As well as like Vlad's just kind of jealous of the happy family life that Jack has. Vlad hates Jack but is in love with Maddie and wants to mold Danny into like his apprentice. Danny of course knows that Vlad is evil but can't tell either of his parents. Jack is oblivious and still thinks that him and Vlad are great friends. And then at the end of this episode, Danny and Vlad come to an agreement to have a truce and that they won't expose each other's identity, since Danny knows that Vlad wouldn't want to reveal his identity to Maddie. So this episode is really fun. It's a great landmark episode introducing the main villain of the series. This is the first one where we really kind of see more of that continuity of the series, and that characters from previous episodes will often come back, as well as we get a really fun soap opera dynamic between all these characters, as well as a hint of where the series is going to go with them. Some other things to note: this is the first appearance of the Fenton RV, or the Fenton family assault vehicle, as Jack calls it, which just kind of becomes their main like method of transportation anytime they have to drive anywhere kind of far. The castle that Vlad owns used to belong to this Dairy King, and at one point we meet his ghost and he's like, hey, not all ghosts are evil, by the way. So that's just an interesting kind of world building there. It's also another like one of the only ghosts that we know for sure like was a real person that like lived at one point. And although Danny doesn't have all his powers yet, even within this episode we get to see him grow a little bit, as he does end up using like the ghost energy shield technique by the end. So that's kind of cool. There's also like a thing that I noticed in this one. At the end of the episode, there's a teddy bear that looks like Albert Einstein that Maddie is sleeping with. And then that comes back in a later episode with Jazz. So just a little Easter egg, I think. That's about it. Just kind of an important episode to introduce like one of the main villains of the series, and a landmark one in the continuity. Thank you very much for watching. Tune in tomorrow for another episode, and subscribe for more Danny Phantom. Welcome back to Danny Phantom Month. Today we're talking about episode 8, Prisoners of Love. This is probably one of my favorite episodes, and I would argue one of the strongest in the series. So, the plot of this one is Jack forgets that it's their wedding anniversary. They get into a fight, and Danny thinks that they might be getting a divorce. Maddie goes to visit her sister, and Jack goes after her to try to apologize, but he forgets his anniversary present. which then Danny accidentally knocks into the ghost zone. And so Danny travels into the ghost zone to try to find it. So this is actually the first episode that we really get a good sense of what the ghost zone looks like, as we get to see Danny actually like travel through it and explore it a little bit. And it's just kind of like this space void with all these different doors and stuff, and each door goes to some other part of the ghost zone. Some of this stuff is actually like kind of weird and creepy. There's this like little kid that like turns his head all the way around like the Exorcist. He does eventually find the present, but he is then confronted by Walker, who is a ghost jail warden. And so Walker takes Danny to ghost jail, which is where we get one of my favorite lines of the series. Danny says, "My folks are splitting up, my sister's a basket case, and I'm going to ghost jail." Which is just my favorite thing. So then, once Danny gets there, he finds out that most of the other prisoners are previous ghosts that he's fought. So all the ones that are there include the Box Ghost, Skulker, Technus, Lunch Lady, and Desiree, who are all from like the last few episodes. And we get this great like moment where he's realizing that his ghost fighting life is oddly paralleling his real life, where they're in the cafeteria and he's like, "Oh, great, everyone that hates me all at one table, just like high school." Which is another amazing line. So first all those ghosts like attack him, but then he manages to reason with them and he's like, "Hey, I didn't put you in jail, okay? I just sent you back to the ghost zone. Walker put us in jail. If we work together, we can probably break out." And so the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and Danny works together with all of the other ghosts to break out of ghost prison. And it's really, really fun. There's some really fun action with Danny and Skulker working together. Then Danny goes to confront Walker. Oh yeah, Walker also has this other great line. He's like, "I'm the warden of this jail. I'm your judge, executioner, jury, executioner, jailer, and if necessary, executioner." And then he's like, "You said executioner 3 times." And he's like, "I really like that part of the job." Walker's just kind of this fun ghost jailer warden who is like very like, "We have to be by the books. We can't break any rules." And Danny is full of rule breaking because he's not from the ghost zone and he has real world contraband and stuff like that. And he's just this like really fun villain. During the fight, Danny ends up being rescued by Sam and Tucker, who have followed him into the ghost zone in the what's called the Spectre Speeder in this episode. I can't remember if it changes later. This is just like a spaceship thing that they use to travel the ghost zone in many episodes, but this is its first appearance. And what they discover is that because everything in the ghost zone is like ghostly and intangible, they as humans actually end up phasing through everything. And so Danny, in order to defeat Walker, just turns back into a kid and takes the present and just leaves, because in the ghost zone, we're the ghosts. Danny returns the present to Jack just in time, but he finds out that the whole thing was just a misunderstanding and that Maddie is visiting her sister to celebrate her sister's 10th anniversary of her divorce. I guess she had a really shitty marriage, and so that's why they're there. And Jack and Maddie had no intention of ever getting divorced. So yeah, it's a pretty lighthearted and fun ending, but I still like the concept of overhearing your parents fighting and not knowing what that means. I think that's very relatable, and definitely a real fear of like some kids is like, does this mean they're getting divorced? What does that mean? Why are mommy and daddy fighting? It's such a like primal little kid anxiety, but I feel like a lot of people have experienced that at some point in their life. So even though it has a happy resolution, I like that the conflict comes from that concept. And yeah, even the crazy ghost prison plot is still related to Danny trying to get the present that he thinks might help fix his parents' marriage. This also really affects Jazz, as she thinks she's smarter than everyone else, and when Jack decides that he's going to apologize, Jazz freaks out because she's like, "Dad never apologizes. That means that I'm wrong. I'm never wrong." And so she like starts questioning her whole existence essentially. And that's just kind of a subplot, ongoing joke. But I like that all the conflict comes from the same idea. We also get a cameo from the Dragon Lady again from that one episode when Tucker and Sam first enter the ghost zone. So yeah, this episode brings back every ghost villain that's been in the show so far except for Vlad. So that's really cool. I think that's about it. There's a subplot with Jack and Maddie in some rural city where her sister lives, and it's mostly just kind of like weird jokes that don't always completely land. But I really like the rest of the conflict in this episode, and I love the idea of a ghost prison so much, where it brings back all these past villains, as well as still introducing a new villain in the form of Walker, and having this crazy story about a ghost prison and the ghost zone and Danny having to break out of ghost jail, but it's still grounded in a sense of a real world problem that Danny has to try to solve, as well as strange parallels where he's like, this is oddly a lot like high school right now, and stuff like that. This episode is really funny. It's got a lot of great moments and excellent uses of the characters and the continuity, as well as building the world in new and creative ways. This ranks really highly for me, and it's probably one of my favorite episodes, so a high recommend for sure. But that about wraps things up. Pick up again with episode 9. Thank you for watching, and subscribe. Subscribe for more Danny Phantom. Welcome back to Danny Phantom Month. Today we are talking about episode 9, which is titled My Brother's Keeper. Another important episode in the overall development and arc of the series, so let's get into it. So Jazz is worried about Danny because she's noticed that he's been acting weird ever since he got his powers. She doesn't know that that's why he's acting weird, but that's the time frame for her. And so she suggests that he see the school guidance counselor, who is Penelope Spectra, who we find out is a ghost who gains energy and youth from the misery of teenagers. And so there's this ghost guidance counselor that's directly benefiting from teenagers' misery, and that's like the premise of the episode. There's a lot of really fun ideas in this one. The biggest important thing that happens is Jazz actually ends up discovering that Danny has ghost powers. And they also point out that this is kind of her first interaction with any of the ghosts. They actually do make a point of having her be in like the other room when like a ghost attack happens in almost every other scene in the series up to this point. And so this is her first encounter with ghosts and her first encounter with Danny Phantom, like him fighting the ghosts. And so she kind of puts 2 and 2 together, and then following him finds out after watching him transform. And yeah, this isn't like a mind erase thing by the end of the episode or anything. This is just a direct change in status quo, which is probably the biggest element of this episode. By the end, she decides not to tell Danny that she knows, but has a new kind of respect for him and a new kind of connection to him in a way, where she now kind of understands what he's dealing with, and so she will continue to help him keep that identity a secret throughout the rest of the series. Danny eventually figures out that Spectra is a ghost because every time he goes into her office it's like really cold, and so he can see his breath, and he thinks that's just because they have the room cold, which they do, but then he realizes that they've done that intentionally so that Danny doesn't notice that his ghost sense is going off whenever he's around her. So that's kind of a fun idea, and cool that the villain is actually smart enough to hide their identity that way. This episode introduces the Fenton Peeler, which is like another one of Jack's gadgets. It's basically like an Iron Man suit that helps you fight ghosts, and a lot like the later movies where like he presses a button and then like a suit goes around you. So it's that, and it pays off nicely as Jazz actually dons the suit towards the end of the episode to help Danny fight Spectra. Danny has a little bit of an arc about how Spectra's making him miserable, and so Danny learns to appreciate his sister more because she does look out for him even though she annoys him most of the time. And so they have like this kind of bonding development where they never really connect like together, but they do individually find more appreciation for each other, and it's kind of cute. Some other little fun things in this episode, because Spectra is causing misery amongst the teens, she's giving all of like the other like supporting characters like terrible advice that just amplify all of their anxieties. It's like played for comedy, but it's like kind of terrifying because it's like exactly all of the anxieties that teenagers feel, and then their guidance counselors not only useless but directly amplifies all of those anxieties.
Come to think of it, my guidance counselor was kind of worthless.
And so it's this almost satirical play on like teenage life and how useless all of the support systems that are supposed to help you seem to be. And so like Paulina is just like even more like, I have to be beautiful or no one will like me. Dash has a great line where he says, it's another day, another 24 hours to a life of pumping gas and stuff like that, which is great. We get to see Valerie again, who just has like a kind of background cameo role in this episode, but which is notable because in the episode following this, she actually becomes a real character. But I always find it interesting to see her fully realized character. There's some kind of weaker elements throughout. Spectre has this sidekick guy who can like shapeshift into different things so that Danny has someone to fight for this episode. Otherwise he doesn't really have much purpose. Although there's a really fun moment where like towards the end of the episode he turns into a ninja and he's like, all right, time for a ninja fight, and Danny's like, I don't have time for this, and just sucks him into the thermos. And Spectra's like ultimate plan is really kind of vague and weird. She arrives during Spirit Week and there's a big spirit assembly that they're gonna have. You can get it because spirits and ghosts and blah blah blah. Do you get it? And the dynamic is really fun, but then like her plan is just to explode Jazz for no reason. I guess so that everyone gets sad that a student died. I don't know. It's not really explained well. So that's one of the kind of weaker elements of this episode is like we see like what her motivation is, and then she also has an evil plan on top of that, and like what her evil plan is doesn't really make any sense. But that's about it. This episode is mostly notable for giving Jazz some actual character development and changing the status quo of the series moving forward. Spectre's a really fun concept for a villain in this episode, and they do some really fun stuff with her. Unfortunately, unlike some of the other villains we've seen so far, they never really use her very effectively in the future. She does come back, but it's never quite as effective as it is in this one. That being said, this episode has some really great satirical high school stuff that touches on like real anxieties and fears of like high school age kids. It's a very good example of Danny Phantom's like high school worldview, which is very satirical but also kind of realistic. Fun episode, good character development for Jazz, and changes the status quo moving forward, which again is a thing I like about the show, is how a seemingly random episode like this can completely change the main character dynamics of the series, and it stays that way. Doesn't get undone by the end of the episode or later on in the series at all. This is the new status quo moving forward. So I really like that about the series. That's about it. Tune in next time for more Danny Phantom. Welcome back to Danny Phantom Month. Today we are talking about episode 10, Shades of Grey. This is the first episode where Valerie becomes a real character, and it's pretty fun. So the plot of this one is there's this ghost dog that ends up destroying this place called Axiom Labs, I think. Basically this technology facility that Valerie's dad works at. And so he's in charge of security. So when it gets destroyed and their new security system fails, Valerie's dad loses his job, and so they have to like straight up sell their house. And even on top of that, when the dog shows up again and it ends up destroying most of the stuff that they owned that they had to sell during a garage sale. Valerie goes from this character who is really rich and popular to now someone who can't afford to go out with her friends, and so they kind of neglect her and she's suddenly all alone. So it's this really kind of cool transformation of what was previously a background character into now a fully fleshed out person with sympathetic motivation and a kind of cool origin. She realizes that Danny and this ghost dog are kind of destroying everything that's important in her life, and is caused her to, you know, suddenly be poor now. She kind of gets this grudge against ghosts, and then she gets a package from Wisconsin in the mail, which turns out to be this like high-tech battle suit and hoverboard that's all like ghost hunting equipment, which ends up being sent by Vlad. So this is actually Vlad's second appearance. He doesn't end up having any lines, but it's cool for a couple reasons. One, Valerie becomes this badass ghost hunter who becomes a main recurring anti-hero for the rest of the series. And two, this opportunity was seized by Vlad, who we know from the previous episode agreed to not directly, but you know, Vlad's craftier than that, and of course didn't say anything about influencing other people to attack him. Tucker tries to make a move on Valerie because he's like, oh, she's no longer popular, now's my chance, which is kind of in character for Tucker, who's kind of shallow like that. But he has had an established crush on Valerie in previous episodes, so it's not completely out of character or anything. And then Valerie realizes that, oh right, Danny's parents are ghost fighters. Maybe if I like actually hang out with Tucker, I might be able to learn something about fighting ghosts. So they kind of start dating, but not really. It's just Tucker carrying her books around. Anyways, there's a great line where Danny says, great, my best friend has a crush on a ghost hunter. And then Sam says something like, well, that's life. Your life anyways. And just another kind of great example of what the show is like, where Danny's crazy ghost fighting life is interfering with his everyday high school life. The plot with the ghost dog is kind of weaker in this episode. I think that's probably why it doesn't fully work for me. So this ghost dog, I guess, was previously a guard dog at the Axiom Labs, and then they're like, we don't want to have guard dogs anymore, so I guess they killed it. And now it's a ghost and it just wants its chew toy back from the labs. And so it keeps trying to get back to the labs. That's why it was there in the first place and wrecked it and stuff. And Danny keeps trying to stop it from destroying shit. All that it ends up being is that the dog wants its chew toy back, and then it gets it and then it leaves. And it doesn't just like leave, it like vanishes. And it's really weird because that doesn't happen ever again, so I don't know what that means. Because I think the dog shows up later too, so, or maybe I'm thinking of the wolf ghost. It doesn't matter. The point is, it's just kind of weird. And also, this ghost dog has the unexplained ability to just phase through the ghost portal when it's closed. Like normally ghosts come in through the ghost portal, but then like you can close it and then they can't get through. And in this one, like, it can just phase through that somehow, and they don't really explain why that is. So no matter how many times Danny throws it back to the ghost, it just comes back in because it does. So that's like another kind of weaker element of this episode. And this one also is sort of strange as a story, because like it's more of just like a setup for Valerie as a character. That being said, Valerie is a really, really cool character, and I want to make that extremely clear. How many other shows have a badass female black anti-hero character that's just like part of the cast? Not many, and even fewer of this era. So she's extremely like notable and important. She also has like understandable motivations. Ghosts did cause her to lose her father's job, and which causes her to be poor and suddenly unpopular. But she goes kind of through a full transformation and arc in this episode, which is basically her origin episode. And now she's a main recurring character. Although they do end up using her in much more interesting ways later on, this still is a crucial episode just in the fact that it sets up Valerie, who goes from a background popular character to a poor person who is no longer popular to this badass anti-hero ghost hunter. And not many characters have that development in cartoons. Oh yeah, there's Sam and Danny kiss in this one, but it's a fake out make out. It's like the Winter Soldier, like, kiss me because public displays of affection make people uncomfortable. It's like that, where they're like trying to distract the person from the real thing. And it's sort of interesting because it's played very asexually in this episode. Like in later episodes they'll do a similar thing, and they'll like lean into that Danny and Sam kind of have a bit of a crush on each other. But like it's really downplayed in this one, which is I just find sort of interesting because it's the first time that they kiss, and it's played as like the most friendly thing possible. They also reference Dumpty Humpty, which is a band, and they're called Dumpty Humpty. They reference them in other episodes. That's why the only reason I'm mentioning it. It's the first time that they show up as a thing. I think that's about it. So another episode that shakes up the status quo, bringing a minor background character into a major supporting character who's also a really cool anti-hero character in their own right, and who we will see in the future gets used in much more interesting ways. An important episode for setup as well as like some cool world building. This is the first time that we get to see Vlad again in a new capacity. And again, this show is really cool for like just changing up things and going in a different direction with some of their supporting characters. This just exists now in the universe, and it's not a one-time thing. It's like she's full-on an anti-hero for the rest of the series. So thank you for watching, and tune in next time for more Danny Phantom. Hello and welcome back to Danny Phantom Month. Today we're talking about episode 11, Fanning the Flames. This one is about Ember McLean, who is a ghost pop punk star who comes to town and starts infecting everyone with her music, because it's like an analogy for what parents think the music that kids listen to is like, where it's influencing them to rebel and to not be good. It's a bad influence and it's no good. You shouldn't be listening to that music. And except that they're right in this one, and Ember turns out to be a ghost who feeds off of people's like worship of her, and like specifically people chanting her name, and that's sort of what the episode is about. This one's really fun for a lot of reasons. Number one, Ember is a really fun design for a character. She has this cool like pop punk goth-ish look. She's not exactly like a one-to-one analogy for like an Avril Lavigne or anything, but she's definitely like an analogy for that type of like early 2000s punk chick type of pop star person. She also has this like really fun power set where her guitar can like shoot different energies, and she has like a dial that does different things. One of them is just a fist, and like when she strums her guitar, like a fist comes out and punches Danny, and like there's one that's like a heart, and then like it makes Danny fall in love with Sam for part of the episode. She also rides her guitar like a surfboard at one point. It's really fun. Ember is one of the characters from this show that gets like the most fan art and cosplay because people really like her design. I also think that the concept of Ember is actually really clever, even though it is kind of like, listen to your parents, kids. Pop stars aren't all that good. That they're bad. They might be ghosts. At the same time, it is a good commentary on the craziness of like certain fandoms and how much people are willing to pay to see people in concert, and how extreme people's like worship of celebrities is, which is, has been a thing for decades now at this point, but is still a relevant theme. And I like the idea that Ember becomes more powerful the more people worship her. Like, that's a fun concept. It is kind of satirical with it. There's a line where everyone's like, "We love you, Ember," and she's like, "That's because I fill the void in your empty lives." And it's really funny. Plot-wise, this one kind of focuses on the Danny and Sam will they won't they, and there's a whole thing about how like everyone's being affected by Ember and like buying her merchandise and dressing like her and all that stuff. Except for Danny and Sam. Danny because he's a ghost, so he's not really affected by her powers, and Sam because she's wearing these like Fenton earphones that block out spectral noise. It's the Fenton gadget of this episode. But later on in the episode, Ember becomes more powerful enough that she can affect Danny, and she makes him fall in love with Sam, or like become infatuated with her to a like debilitating degree where like he can't function properly. And there's some really funny parts with that dynamic actually as well, because it's this episode is actually really well written and has some really great jokes. There's a part where like Sam's about to fall off a building if Danny doesn't help her. She's like, "Dude, snap out of it, like I'm gonna die," and he's like, "Wow, you're really pretty when you're about to fall off a building." And it's stuff like that. Normally I think the Danny and Sam relationship is kind of boring, but in this one it's fun and cute, mostly because the writing is really strong and there's some good jokes. There's this really cute moment where Danny and Sam ditch class and like, because Danny just uses his powers so that they like fly out of the school and like through the walls and stuff, and it's just this really cute moment of them like flying through the town, and it's very Can You Read My Mind from Superman, but I still really like it and think it's really cute, and it's the kind of scene I want to see more of in like Spider-Man movies. In the first Amazing Spider-Man they almost do it, but then they cut away, and then in Far From Home there's a scene where him and MJ swing through the city, but then it's like played as a joke and she's like, wow, that really sucked and was awful, and I'm like, just be cute and adorable, you fucking Spider-Man movies. I want to see Spider-Man swing through the city with a girl and it be cute and romantic. Why can't I have that? Anyways, there's a subplot about how Lancer really hates Ember because she's distracting everyone from their schoolwork, which is relevant to him because there's like a big national test that's coming up soon, and he says something about how his bonus is based on how well they do on the test. For Lancer Book Report today, we get 3 books this time: Pride and Prejudice, Chicken Soup for the Soul, and Lord of the Flies. So that's a record number of Lancer book reports for an episode. So there you go. Oh, there's a really fun moment, like even Jazz is affected by this, and so their parents are like concerned. They're concerned that they're too obsessed with Ember, and Danny at this point is obsessed with Sam, and so Jack has a line about, hey, why don't we throw them in the Fenton Stockades, which is just like a coffin with spikes in it, and Maddie's like, we can't do that. And then Jack's like, fine, we'll just ground them like normal parents, and it's great. This is also the first appearance of Klemper, who's just this like retard ghost with ice powers. I don't know, man. It's kind of, I'm not sure what they're exactly doing with him, but I bring it up because he shows up in later episodes. So yeah, I think that's about it. This is a really fun episode with a cool and fun villain that has a very unique power set. It has a really great use of all the characters, them all being affected by Ember in different ways. And I don't mind the Danny and Sam stuff because it's funny and even cute at some moments. So tune in next time for more Danny Phantom. Hello and welcome back to Danny Phantom Month. Today we are talking about episode 12, Teacher of the Year. This is the video game episode, and I think it's really fun. So the plot of this one is Danny and Tucker are really into this new video game called Doomed, which is an online game, so I'll get back to, but it's causing Danny to lose sleep, and therefore his grades start to decline. So his teacher Lancer is like, you need to study, I'm gonna make you take this makeup test because you failed the real one, so now's your chance to make it up. Meanwhile, Technus gets loose and decides to go into the game, so now he's wreaking havoc in the game, but Danny can't play the game because he has to study for this big test. And that's the conflict of this episode. It's actually interesting because it's kind of the reverse of what the trope normally is, where usually Danny has ghost fighting responsibilities that interfere with his real world responsibilities, but this case is actually the opposite, where his real world responsibility studying for this test is interfering with his ghost fighting responsibilities. But it's a kind of fun dynamic. We get a lot of Lancer in this episode, which is always great. No Lancer book report, surprisingly. What I find most interesting about this episode is how they handle video games, and it's very, very early 2000s, and I kind of love it. It was sort of this era where people knew that kids really liked video games, but the people who are in charge of writing cartoons and stuff for kids of this time, like, didn't quite grow up with the video games that are currently popular, so they, like, don't really quite understand how they work. And also the same with the internet at this time. The internet is still pretty new. Like, YouTube wasn't even a thing yet, but at this time. And so again, the people writing shows and cartoons around this time don't exactly know how the internet works. Or at least they don't know how to tell stories of it. And so there's a lot of this kind of media around this time where people get trapped in the internet or like trapped in a video game and stuff. There's a Fairly Odd Parents episode where he goes inside the internet that's very, very similar to this one. You have Spy Kids 3D. There's both a Ben 10 and a Kim Possible episode where they go into a video game, and it's very similar to this one. But I really, really like the aesthetic of this episode because it's so not with the times. And it's really ironic too because they make a joke about techness. When he's in the video game, he doesn't understand it at all because he's like completely out of date. So he's like, oh, I'm what the kids say, far out, man. And it's like, that's the joke, is like, oh man, he really doesn't understand video games, but like, neither do the writers of this episode. So the plot of the episode is that Technus wants to beat this game, which is an online game, because when you collect all the keys and you beat all the levels, you unlock access to the World Wide Web. So you beat this online game in order to gain access to the internet. How are you playing the game then? I don't know. So that's what I mean, where like this show really doesn't quite understand what it's talking about. But that makes this episode all the more fun for me to watch because I just find this aesthetic like really, really funny and really entertaining, of like adults trying to understand video games and the internet and not quite getting it. But at the same time, as a kid, I was totally fooled and loved this episode. So like, it's this weird mishmash of things. I think it's more the aesthetic of this episode, just like how they designed the video game world. Everything's like a little bit pixely and like, it's very Tron, Matrixy, like lots of neon green and stuff, and I really like it. It's fun. This episode also has the cliche of like, there's this big strong guy in the game and Tucker and Danny are always trying to fight him, but he always beats them. And then they find out that, oh, it was actually Sam in the game. What? Oh my gosh, I can't even possibly believe that a girl would play video games. What a twist. Like, as a trope and a concept for a thing, it's fine. It's a little bit weird in this episode because it does make Danny and Tucker act a little bit out of character, because Sam's like, how could I help fight Technus? And they're like, you don't even understand video games. How could you help us fight a ghost, even though you do that all the time? So it's kind of weird, but whatever, I can forgive it for the most part. The other notable thing about this episode is it essentially has the same plot of the movie Ready Player One, where they have to get all the keys to beat the levels, and oh, the big strong guy turned out to be a girl. Only here, it's more forgivable because this was 2004 and people didn't know how to write stuff about video games. Where now, having the same exact tropes of the Danny Phantom episode about video games, it's kind of like, wow, that movie does not know how to do video games. This is the first major reappearance of Technus and the first episode to just bring back a villain and not introduce a new one. So we've gone 11 episodes in a row, all introducing a new villain that becomes a major part of Danny's rogues gallery. Finally, 12 episodes in, we see a reappearance of a villain. But again, he's used in a new way. Last time Technus just controlled technology in the real world. This time it's in the digital world. He also gets a couple new designs, mostly this like spider bot version of himself, which is kind of fun. And yeah, again, he's being used in a new way. It is weird that when Tucker first meets Technus in the game that he doesn't recognize him for some reason, even though he's clearly Technus. But then again, Danny and Tucker have the same faces, and Danny's username is Ghost Boy, and nobody figures out who he is. So, I don't know. The answer is don't think about it. At the end of the episode, Danny applies himself and actually gets an A minus, but still. So we learn that, like, if he actually tries hard, can do pretty well in school. Like most kids. Like, if you actually study and try hard, you can do all right. Problem is that school is boring as shit and no one wants to do that. But there's this fun moment where Lancer's trying to relate to Danny and he's like, oh, I never get to see my sister. And Danny's like, I'm 14. I don't really care. and it's amazing. But then he does study, and then he does do well in the test, and Lancer's like, the old I don't get to see my sister trick gets him every time. And then he's like, how come they never figure out that it's me in a wig? And we look at the picture of his sister, and it's clearly him in a wig. He still has the beard and everything. It's really weird, but I don't know, it's kind of fun. Wow, the sun is bright today. At the end of the episode, they beat Technus, and they're about to beat the video game, and then, oh yeah, they trap Lancer in what they call level 0, which is a glitch in the program, which is just like, I guess an area you can get trapped in because it's a glitch or something. I don't know, don't think about it. The problem is with this episode is, again, like, don't think too hard about stuff because they constantly get video game terminology wrong, and the rules of how the game work doesn't make any sense, but whatever. So they're about to beat the game, but then they get killed by Lancer, who's been playing the game the whole time, and it's like, that's fun. They actually do kind of set this up in a couple of ways. Lancer first meets Danny at a computer lab that's like a gaming lab, I guess, and he's like, hey, what are you doing here? Shouldn't you be studying? But then you like think to yourself, what's Lancer doing there? He's there to play the game. See, that's kind of clever. And then later, Danny logs onto Lancer's computer and is able to quickly message his friends in the game. But it's like, oh well, how is he able to do that? Because Lancer already had the game installed on his computer. It makes sense. It's a really fun episode. I like the dynamic between Danny having to study and Danny having to fight ghosts. I really, really like the gaming aesthetic, even though it makes no fucking sense at all. But I find it really charming and kind of nostalgic of this era where people didn't know how to write video games, but they did it anyways because they knew they were popular. That's about it. So thank you for watching. Tune in next time for more Danny Phantom. Welcome back to Danny Phantom Month. Today we are talking about episode 13, which is just called 13. So the plot of this one is Jack and Maddie have designed a new security system for the ghost portal where you just press your thumbprint, and if you're a member of the Fenton family, you can activate the portal. And Jack has just been like doing it over and over again, and so there's just like a lineup of ghosts at the portal that are like waiting for it to open so they can take their turn to leave. And we follow this pair of ghosts called Johnny 13 and his girlfriend Kitty. And Johnny 13 is just like this guy with a motorcycle. Kitty is basically just like a girl. That's about it. But Johnny 13, he also has his shadow can like come alive, and it has bad luck powers, kind of. So anyways, we follow them. They just make it in time into the real world, except, actually I gotta get this. Hello? So Johnny makes it through the portal just in time, but it closes right when his girlfriend Kitty is about to go through. So they're sort of trapped like in between the ghost zone and the real world for a brief moment. And Kitty's like, okay, I'm gonna put my essence into my clothes. If you get some chick to wear them, I'll be able to possess her body and be there with you in the real world. Then Johnny makes it through and notices Jazz is there, and he's like, well, there's my new girlfriend. Now we have our episode. One thing to point out in the lineup of ghosts at the ghost portal, you can see Ember, which is kind of cool, and she's even back to having the short hair that she had at the end of the episode, because like her hair gets longer the more powerful she gets. So like that's a nice little nod. So yeah, the main plot of this episode is that Jazz starts dating Johnny 13, and Danny's upset because she's dating a ghost. So that's the conflict. This is a fun episode. We get a lot of fun interactions with Danny and his family, as he's really worried about the guy that his sister is dating, because he's like he's clearly bad news. He's a ghost, and Jazz doesn't see that. And Danny is actually for once on the same page as his parents, and he starts to realize that like, oh no, am I gonna become my parents? This might be bad. And his friends are like, well, you're both on ghosts, so like, maybe. So yeah, there's a lot of fun moments with this dynamic. There's a part where Danny pretends to like fall out of a tree so like he can interrupt Jazz and Johnny like getting together. Then she's like, you were spying on me? And then his parents are like, you were spying on her? Good work. Feel free to do it again. Also in this episode, there's a B-plot about Tucker, who is getting made fun of because he's a techno geek, which of course he is. He really likes technology. That's kind of his only thing. But then he has a couple interactions with the shadow ghost that's related to Johnny 13 that has bad luck powers, so now people are calling him Bad Luck Tuck. And he's like, I need a new image. And Sam's like, you should go goth. So then he goes goth, and he's like, I don't like being goth. She's like, yep, you should go back to being a geek, because that's what you like doing. And he's like, you're right. And that's that arc. It's a pretty standard Tucker and Sam B-plot. Don't have a whole lot to say about it, but I do sort of like the idea of, you know, high school kids trying out different labels and changing what it is that defines them. There's something there. They don't go into it a whole lot because unfortunately Tucker and Sam are a little bit one-dimensional, so there isn't a whole lot to go into. It's just the B-plot. It's not like a huge issue with the episode or anything. Back to the A-plot, it's really fun. There's a lot of great lines. There's a moment where Danny says, my sister's dating a ghost and I'm turning into my parents. I love when the show just like explains what the conflict of the episode is. It's also usually after like a commercial break or something, so it's like, oh, we gotta catch the audience up on what's happening in case they just tuned in. This is a very solid, fun episode. There's a great moment towards the end where the Fentons are like, all right, we're gonna stop Jazz from dating this guy. Bring out the Fenton anti-creep stick, which is just a baseball bat with the word Fenton on it. And it's amazing. And I think it comes back in later episodes too. That's about it. Danny figures out that Jazz needs to wear their clothes, so he manages to take like Katie's clothes off of Jazz. And then he figures out that the shadow ghost is weak to light, so they go to a baseball diamond. They use Tucker's newfound appreciation of his geek knowledge to hack into the lights, and they put on the lights and the shadow goes away and everything gets wrapped up in a neat little bow. And there's a joke where Danny gets a jumpsuit at the end, and his parents are like, you're gonna be like us one day, and he's like, I hate this. And it's like, because the label thing from before about Tucker, and it's all in a neat little bow. Yeah, so it's a really fun episode. Nothing too crazy here. We do, of course, get the introduction of Johnny 13 and Kitty, who come back in later episodes as well. It's just a fun episode with the dynamic of, oh no, my sister's dating a ghost, which is a wacky Danny Phantom scenario. But again, it's rooted in something kind of realistic, which of course, the fear of like, I don't trust the guy that my sister's dating. And like, that's a completely valid and real fear. Of course, in this case, it's like, well, he's a ghost, so like, of course Danny was right all along, but you know. The point is, it's a wacky scenario that comes out of a potentially real scenario. And that's again what I like about this show, is its expert balance of superheroics and real world problems. So that's about it. Thank you for watching, and tune in next time for more Danny Phantom. Welcome back to Danny Phantom Month. Today we're talking about episode 14, Public Enemies. This is the first one where Walker comes back, and it's really fun. So the main plot of this one is Walker wants to capture Danny, and he enlists one of his prisoners, which is this wolf ghost, just called Wolf, who can claw into the real world. That's his power, I guess. So yeah, Walker has this elaborate plot to draw Danny out. He tries to set the wolf on him, and then he enlists all of his prison guards to like attack the town, to try to lure Danny out, I guess. This is the first one where like they kind of amp up the scale, and it's like, oh yeah, the whole town is under attack by ghosts. So cat's out of the bag, ghosts exist. There's no debate anymore. And so the mayor enlists Jack and Maddie Fenton, the town's resident ghost hunters, to take on this threat. And so they bring on all these rules. There's a curfew, all the kids have to be escorted home and stuff. Danny's parents like guard them while they're having lunch at school. And so Danny's of course humiliated by his crazy parents, but at the same time there's this real ghost threat. But then because his parents are there and everyone's around, he keeps having trouble finding an area where he can go ghost. This episode is one of the first to up the scale with the entire town being attacked by ghosts, and also up the action. It's a very action heavy episode. There's a sequence where Walker and some of his like guards have like overshadowed Dash and Paulina and all the bullies, and Lancer and the principal, and they all have this crazy fight with Danny. They should all be dead, like, but I guess because they're in ghost bodies, it's fine. Meanwhile, Tucker realizes that this wolf ghost is not actually a bad guy. He just has this shock collar that's causing him to attack them, and he also realizes that the wolf is speaking this language that they made up for the show that's, I guess, supposed to be kind of like Latin, where it's this dead language that nerds use to communicate, and so Tucker kind of knows it a little bit. So anyways, there's a B-plot about Tucker and Sam figuring out how to get the collar off of the wolf. I think this is also the first episode where we see Tucker's parents. This crazy high action plot happening, but it still ends up being sort of relatable in the fact that all the conflict comes out of Danny's personal life. He's still facing Lancer and Dash and all the people he normally deals with, but in a new context. His parents are embarrassing him at school the way that they normally do. There's a moment towards the end when Maddie is like trying to get Danny because she's like, ah, another ghost, gotta get it, gotta get that ghost. And Danny gets away, and then she's like, we'll meet again. And then Danny's like, yeah, I'll see you at dinner. And it's really fun stuff like that. This episode has one of the coolest endings of any of the episodes, where Walker kind of wins. He doesn't accomplish his main goal of capturing Danny and bringing him into the ghost zone as his prisoner, but he manages to stage this attack on the mayor, and so the whole town now thinks that Danny, as, you know, the ghost boy, is trying to attack the mayor. And so he becomes public enemy number one for the town, which is a kind of cool idea. It's very Spider-Man with the bugle and stuff like that, but I like it a lot where even though the town thinks he's a villain and the news is like shitting on him, he still decides to try to be a hero anyways. This episode has a really great use of all the characters. Tucker and Sam have a reasonable B-plot that's actually related to the main story. All of Danny's school conflicts with Dash and Lancer and all of them are done in a new way with Walker, one of the most competent of Danny's villains. Jack and Maddie are used spectacularly. We really get to see how cool Maddie is in this episode. There's this great moment where she like takes out two ghosts and then uses her lipstick to like mark a tally on her gun and then freshens up her lipstick. It's amazing. Even Jazz has a couple cool moments in this one. And that's about it. Just like a really, really fun high action episode that is probably one of my favorites. Even though there is a lot of high action, there's still a lot of great jokes, and it's still tonally consistent and still manages to balance Danny's personal and ghost fighting life. There's a couple Lancer book report moments for this episode. We got Bridget Jones' Diary and Adventures of Huck Finn. I think that's about it. Really strong episode, fun action, cool ending with Walker. We introduce Wolf, who shows up in later episodes as well. And yeah, just a really good use of all the characters in a fun new way. That's about it. Thank you for watching, and tune in next time for more Danny Phantom. Welcome back to Danny Phantom Month. Today we're talking about episode 15, Fright Night. This is the Halloween special, and it's really, really fun. So Danny and Dash get into sort of a fight, and Lancer is going to give them detention, but he decides instead to make a contest for them because the teachers have a Halloween party every year, and this year it's Lancer's turn to host. So he's instructing Danny and Dash to both make a haunted house room, and whoever does it better gets out of detention. And then Danny and Dash also have a side bet that if Danny wins, Dash has to run around the school in his underwear or something like that. But if Dash wins, Danny has to eat a pair of Dash's underwear somehow. So it looks like Dash might actually be able to win this one. So in a desperate attempt to not eat Dash's underwear, Danny travels to the ghost zone to steal the sword of the spirit of Halloween, the Fright Night, Night with a K. So then he has this ghost sword that's Halloween themed, and he brings it into his haunted house and it brings everything alive. The sword is called the Soul Shredder, and if you get stabbed by the sword, you get transported to a dimension where you're tormented by your greatest fear. So Lancer's like, yeah, this is pretty scary. I'm probably gonna give you the win, but then of course things get out of hand, and the Fright Night shows up, played by Michael Dorn, and it's amazing because he's super, super campy and way over the top, and I love it. Hijinks ensue. Danny has to fight the Fright Night. Then Sam figures out how to defeat him because she has this book that she found that like chronicles the legend of the Fright Night, and if you sheath his sword into a pumpkin, he returns to the ghost zone. and so Danny fights him, then does that. Then the Fright Night goes away, and at the end of the episode he admits that he sort of cheated on the haunted house contest, and so the win goes to Dash. This is a really fun episode. There's a lot of stuff that I really like about it. Mostly just the Fright Night and his whole design and aesthetic. I love the concept of a Halloween ghost night. Like it's this weird mixture of different things that shouldn't really work together, but in a weird way they kind of do. I really like how he has this whole mythology around him that they establish in the episode. It feels very Buffy because like Sam pulls out like a goth book that like tells all about the Fright Night, and then there's like a picture of like what his lair looks like, and Danny's like, I've seen that, that's in the ghost zone. That's why he gets the idea to go there. And yeah, it has a whole mythology about like how to defeat him and what his powers come from. And I really like that idea. It's very much like a Buffy episode where like there's some weird creature that they're fighting, and then Willow looks up in the books what kind of creature it is, and they find out what its weakness is and all that stuff. But in a Halloween episode, I think that really works. Anything with a magic sword, I'm in. So I really like the Soul Shredder. I love that it has a little pumpkin on the end of it. I think that's amazing. And again, Michael Dorn's performance really makes this episode great. He has all these like really campy, I am the Fright Night like lines, and he just sells it. It's amazing. This episode is interesting in that it's paced very differently than most episodes. Usually there's a lot more back and forth between Danny's high school life and his ghost fighting life. But in this one, it's much more linear. It starts with an everyday problem. It then escalates when Danny tries to use a supernatural solution to that problem. The Fright Night doesn't even show up till about halfway through the episode, and then the last like third of the episode is just him fighting the Fright Night. It's still a perfectly acceptable structure. It's just interesting because it's different than most episodes of the series. Normally Danny will have around 3 encounters of the villain ghost of the episode, each interrupting him at a different moment in his regular problem of the episode, until the end when he figures out how to defeat them and solve his everyday problem. This episode still works, but I found it sort of jarring when Danny's fighting the Fright Night for the first time in the episode, about 15 minutes in to the 20-minute episode, and then I realized, wait, this is when he defeats him. This is the same scene. Normally it's just structured a little bit differently. Sorry I talked so long about story structure, but that's sort of how I understand things, so that's what I look for. But this episode still 100% works, and I still really like it. The reason it works is it is built from a regular everyday problem of Danny trying to get out of detention and having a rivalry with Dash, as well as him learning a lesson that 1, it was wrong to steal from an evil Halloween ghost, and 2, that he shouldn't have cheated in this contest. And so we still get the little like, oh, he's facing an everyday problem, he learns a lesson, all that stuff. It's just structured a little bit differently. And the other point that it feels a little weird is when things start going wrong, he doesn't immediately go, okay, I made a mistake, I shouldn't have done this. He waits a little bit too long for Lancer to be like, yeah, okay, you win the contest. And by that point it's gone way too far, and he like really should have noticed that there was spooky ghost stuff happening before that. So the pacing just feels a little bit strange to me. That being said, this is still a really fun episode. Fright Night is one of my favorite of Danny's Rose Galleries just because of his design and the mythology behind him and how they decided to go about a Halloween ghost. Because like every week he's fighting ghosts, so like having a ghost that's Halloween themed, like what do you do differently? And I like that instead of doing a very like Nightmare Before Christmas type thing where it's like, okay, take the Halloween aesthetic and crank it up to 11, they just like go in a completely different direction. They're like, no, this one's gonna have a medieval aesthetic instead, but we're gonna make it work somehow. Which I think is great. I think that's about it. Good moments from most of the supporting characters. His parents get some fun stuff about them freaking out because Halloween has the most ghost activity of any night of the year, and like Tucker having a plan to get the maximum amount of Halloween candy during the night, as well as some great moments with Dash and Lancer. The Lancer book report for this episode is Grapes of Wrath. That about wraps things up. A really fun episode with a fun villain, solid Halloween special, and just like a really solid episode overall, even if the structure is a little bit different. Thank you for watching, and tune in next time for more Danny Phantom. Hello and welcome back to Danny Phantom Month. Today we're talking about episode 16, Maternal Instinct. This one is more focused on Danny's family family than his like high school life. It's one of only a few episodes to really do that. Danny goes on a trip with his mom to what she thinks is a science convention, but ends up being a scam by Vlad to try to get Maddie and Danny to live with him in like one of his mansions in the woods somewhere. Meanwhile, he's sent a bunch of ghost animals to kill Jack, and so Jack and Jazz have to work together to fight them off. There isn't a whole lot to this episode other than a few kind of progressive moments and a couple good jokes. It's basically a mother-son bonding story between Danny and his mom. They go on this adventure together, and so they learn to appreciate each other a little bit more. His mom wishes that they hung out more like they did when Danny was little, but now he's a teenager, so he's angsty and doesn't want to hang out with his parents. Vlad has this device that shorts out Danny's powers for a few hours, which means that he has to rely on his mom to fight off ghosts. And then yeah, Danny has to outsmart Vlad in order to defeat him. He uses his mom's Spectre Deflector, which is this belt that protects you from ghosts, but then when Danny wears it, it hurts him. So the same thing happens to Vlad, and so Danny is able to trick Vlad into putting that on him, and then he's able to defeat him because Vlad is weakened. This is the first episode that brings back Vlad in a major capacity, and the reason Danny's able to outsmart him is that he plays to Vlad's weaknesses, which is his want of a family. Vlad desperately wants what Jack has, which is a family that love him, and Vlad is this desperate, sad guy who has all the money in the world but no one to share it with. And so Danny's able to trick him into saying, yeah, you know what, I do not want to be with my parents anymore. I want you to be my new dad, and Vlad completely falls for it. It's sort of interesting because Danny will use a similar tricks multiple times throughout the series, and Vlad always falls for it because that's how badly he wants it to be true. It's sort of what makes him an interesting and compelling villain, is that he has very human wants and needs, but he doesn't understand how you achieve those things. And that's what makes Danny and Vlad's relationship so interesting, is that Vlad genuinely wants to be a part of Danny's life, but Danny won't let him because he's a creep and evil and wants to date his mom. We get to see Maddie being really cool in this episode. She has a lot of fun moments. We get to see how she's actually really capable at fighting ghosts and really good at like wilderness survival and skills like that that end up being really, really helpful. And we get some fun kind of moments in the B-plot with Jack and Jazz as well, as they kind of bond a little bit over fighting ghosts. Something that Jazz is like not interested in, but kind of realizes that it is in her blood and it is in her family, and so it is a part of her whether she likes it or not. And they get a little fun B story as well. Not a whole lot more to this one. One thing to note is that there's a training sequence at the beginning of the episode where Danny attempts to do the splitting into two thing that Vlad can pull off. At this point he can only split into having two heads, but not full into two distinct Dannys. So he's not quite there yet, but we do get to see that his powers are developing. We see the Spectre Deflector, and I think there's another gadget that is sort of like a whip, which are gadgets that are used in later episodes as well. And yeah, it's a fun kind of family bonding episode. The first reuse of Vlad. Also of note that this is one of the only episodes of this season that doesn't introduce a new villain, unless you count the animal ghosts, which turn out to just be the ghosts of animals that Vlad has hunted, and he's trying to get them to work with him, and then eventually they turn on him, which again falls into like Vlad's tragic flaw, never being able to have people that actually care about him because he only uses people for his own personal gain. And so even when he does get someone to work on his side, they eventually turn on him. And yeah, that's about it. We get some fun stuff with Vlad. There's a scene where he's reading a book that's like, it was like How to Seduce Women for Creepy Rich Dudes or something like that, which is really funny. And yeah, that's about it. We do get to see that Danny's progressed a lot in his powers. He's much more capable of facing Vlad one-on-one than he was in their first encounter. But overall, not a whole lot to this episode. It is kind of fun, but it's not quite as interesting as most of the other episodes of the season. That's about it. Thank you for watching, and tune in next time for more Danny Phantom. Welcome back to Danny Phantom Month. Today we are talking about episode 17, Lucky in Love. This is probably one of my favorite episodes. So Danny and friends are at the water park when Danny accidentally reveals his secret identity to Paulina. So Paulina finds out that he has powers, and it's like, oh shit. So then the next day Paulina's like, yeah, I think it's cool that you have powers. So Danny and Paulina start dating, and there's like this fun montage of them dating. There's this great part where Dash is like, alright Fenton, I guess you're popular now because you're dating Paulina, so here's your popularity membership, and here's your hall pass punch card. Every time you see the hall monitor, they'll punch your card, and every 10th stamp you get a free frozen yogurt. He like assigns him a nerd to like do his homework for him and stuff. It's amazing. So then because of this, Quan, the other jock football player, gets pushed down a peg, so he's no longer allowed to be popular because they're out of members. Danny took his place at the cool kids table. So then Quan starts hanging out with Tucker and Sam, and so there's this amazing montage of like Danny and Paulina going on dates, and like he's fighting ghosts and she's like yay, because he doesn't have to keep his identity a secret, and it's like everything he ever wanted. And meanwhile like Quan is trying to hang out with Tucker and Sam, but they're like too different, so they just don't get along at all. So then while this is all happening, Tucker decides to make a move on Star, who he calls the Satellite. She's been a character in the background before, but I think this is the first episode where she actually gets like lines. They describe her as, oh, the marginally attractive girl who orbits around the most popular girl, so that's why they call her the Satellite. So because like Danny's now dating Paulina, the social like structure is all shifted, and so Tucker is like, that means that I have an opportunity to make a move on this girl Star. So then he does, and she's like, it's about time, okay, here's my books, you have to carry them, we're going on a date Friday. And he's like, yay, it worked. So now Sam is without her friend Tucker, and so she goes on a pity date with Quan, because Quan's like, nobody likes me, I can't be popular with the popular kids, and even the losers don't even like me now. She's like, fine, I'll go on a pity date with you. And within like, I assume it's like a couple days, the entire social structure has shifted because two people started dating, and these different groups of people are hanging out, and now these two are dating. It's just like messed up entire friend groups and the social dynamics of high school, which is like pretty accurate for like how high school relationships start, where like, oh, these two people started dating, so now I don't see my friend anymore, and like, oh, this person's dating this person, so their friends started hanging with the other person's friends, and now they're all dating. It's like pretty accurate in how quickly like those kind of relationships start, where it's like seemingly overnight. So yeah, just really fun satirical high school dynamics in this episode. So then Johnny 13 shows up, and he's like, Danny, stay away from my girl. And we find out that Paulina has actually been possessed by Kitty, his girlfriend from the episode with Johnny 13. And so we find out that she's only possessed Paulina because she's trying to make Johnny jealous by dating the guy that he like hates the most. Again, a very like high school thing to do, but it's elevated through crazy ghosts and superhero shenanigans, which is probably the strongest thing about this episode, is just how intertwined and interconnected all these different characters are. And so we get both high school relationship drama and superhero ghost fighting stuff all in the same thing that's happening, and that's where all the conflict comes from. It's not just like, oh, Danny's gotta fight a villain or something. It's the girl he likes is possessed by a ghost, so because she's trying to make her boyfriend jealous, and like, it's all this like really fun crazy stuff that I like a lot. So then Kitty pressures Danny into still dating her, because she's like, I'll tell everyone your secret if you don't. So then Danny's like, shit, what do I do now? In the B story with Tucker and Sam, eventually Quan and Star realize that like, even though they're not as cool as like Danny and Paulina currently are, they're way cooler than Tucker and Sam, so they ditch them and they start dating, which is also like, yeah, that's also pretty accurate for like relationships to just switch like that really quickly in high school. That happens sometimes. So that kind of gets resolved. And Tucker and Sam help Danny figure out a plan to get out of this situation, which he makes a deal with Johnny to get into a fake fight with him. So then what happens at the end is Danny and Johnny stage this fake fight where Danny like beats him up in front of Kitty, which makes her instinctually run to him because she's like, oh no, I don't want to see him hurt, because she does really like Johnny and not Danny. And so they end up back together, and Danny's like, good, that's dealt with. Oh yeah, and also during this whole thing, Johnny has stolen some technology from the Fenton's workshop that he's attached to his bike, so he can now use his bike to travel between the ghost zone and the real world. So yeah, then they do that. Johnny and Kitty go back to the ghost zone, and yeah, that's about it. The episode is then resolved. Really, really cool conclusion to the episode where Danny doesn't just fight the bad guy, he actually uses the different characters' motivations and is able to come up with a plan where everyone gets out of the situation okay. And that's one of the things that's cool about the show is like the villains and the ghosts that Danny fights, like they're not really just evil villains, they're like people. They have different motivations and different wants and needs and different goals that they're trying to accomplish. And in this situation, Danny just figures out how to resolve the situation by playing to those wants and motivations. And yeah, he outsmarts the villains rather than just brute force defeating them. And I find that really, really fun and really cool. A couple other things. This is the first episode where Danny gets the name Invis-O-Bill by the news, which is hilarious and great. And yeah, that's what like the news calls the ghost boy. And this is post the episode with Walker where the news thinks he's a villain. And so there's stuff going wrong at the water park at the beginning of the episode from Johnny 13's shadow that Danny fights, and the news blames Danny for those events, calling him Invis-O-Bill because they don't know what his name is. And a really funny moment early on in the episode when Paulina first announces that Danny and her are dating, where this like nerdy guy has like a locker with like a shrine to Paulina in it, and he's just like, no, because he thinks his chances of being with her are destroyed, which is paid off at the end when we see in Paulina's locker that she has a shrine to Invis-O-Bill because she's in love with the ghost boy but not Danny Fenton. And so the episode resolves with everyone getting what they want except for Danny. Except that he does make a difference in the sense that he's not in a fake relationship and not being used by someone to make someone else jealous, and has rescued Paulina from being possessed by a ghost. So he does win in a sense, but he's still single in the end of the day. And Paulina's in love with his superhero self, but not his regular self, which is a fun dynamic. It's essentially the same thing they do with Flash Thompson in the Spider-Man, where Flash is like super into Spider-Man. He's like, Spider-Man's the best, that guy's awesome, but he thinks Peter Parker is like the worst and sucks. So yeah, it's that fun dynamic. So really, really great episode. Lots of fun character dynamics and satirical high school character relationships. Really great use of Johnny 13 and Kitty, and just using that relationship to play with different character dynamics in Danny's friend group, which is great. And of course, excellent balance of ghost fighting super heroics with everyday high school problems. That's about it. Really great episode. Thank you for watching, and tune in next time for more Danny Phantom. Welcome back to Danny Phantom Month. Today we are talking about episode 18, Life Lessons. This is another great episode. This is the first one where Valerie comes back, so naturally it's gonna be good. Valerie and Danny get partnered up together in like a home ec class, I guess, where they have an assignment where they have to take care of a sack of flour with a happy face on it as like a simulation for taking care of a baby. Naturally, Valerie and Danny don't get along because they spend the other half of their time together fighting, although Valerie doesn't know Danny's secret. Meanwhile, Skulker shows up and notices that Valerie is actually quite the competent hunter herself. So he kind of manipulates Danny and Valerie to fight a couple times to try to determine which is the strongest and the most formidable opponent for him to hunt, as he's the Ghost Zone's greatest hunter. Skulker is interestingly played by Kevin Michael Richardson this time, as opposed to Matthew St. Patrick in the first couple episodes with Skulker. And yeah, he's just Kevin Michael Richardson for the rest of the show. Which is nothing bad with Kevin Michael Richardson, he's got a great voice. There's a few line deliveries that I always kind of preferred Matthew St. Patrick's delivery on, such as the way he says Ghost Child.
Payback time, Ghost Child.
I hope you've enjoyed your freedom, Ghost Child.
Skulker's still a fun character, so it's still fun to see him. Eventually, Skulker brings Danny and Valerie to the Ghost Zone, to his like lair, to hunt them sort of Predator style. And so Danny and Valerie have to learn to work together in order to escape the Ghost Zone. Oh yeah, and they also have the sack of flour with them while they're doing this, so they have to also protect that. This is the first instance in which we see Skulker's lair, which is sort of interesting because they reference it in the Halloween episode. It's one of the images on the map that Danny's drawing of the Ghost Zone. Sometimes the order of Danny Phantom episodes is a little bit unclear because it's different depending on the sources you go to, and some of the episodes aired out of order and stuff like that. The Halloween episode aired originally in October, close to Halloween, so that made sense. I'm going off of the official I'm going off of the official DVD release for this season because that seems to be pretty consistent with the order of episodes and just continuity-wise. For example, in this episode, we see Valerie in her room, in her like shitty apartment, where she has all these like newspaper clippings of like sightings of the ghost boy up on her walls, and we see there's one that says, "Who's the ghost boy dating?" And it's got like a picture of Paulina and as well as a picture of Sam on it, which I think is great, even though it's like questionable of like where that newspaper came from and do they know Danny's personal life, because that'd be kind of weird. But still, it's I think it's just connecting the dots of like, hey, Paulina and Sam seem to be often in the same location that the ghost boy shows up in, which makes sense. There's also another newspaper clipping that says that the mayor declares the ghost boy enemy number one, which of course is from the second Walker episode. So this episode is clearly like after all those. I mean, it's possible as well that Danny has had like other encounters with Skulker between episodes, so you know, who knows. So Danny and Valerie now have to work together in the ghost zone to both protect the sack of flour that's part of their assignment, as well as not die and escape. And so they learn to appreciate each other, and they realize that, you know what, the other person really isn't all that bad. Danny thinks at first that Valerie's being really selfish because she doesn't want to spend time taking care of the sack of flour, even though it's supposed to be like a 50-50 kind of project. And she's like, look, my life's really busy, okay? You don't understand. And Danny thinks it's like, yeah, you're busy hunting me, like, and so he doesn't think that that's like a valid excuse. But then he finds out throughout the episode that like she has a job, like a real job, where she's just has to dress up in a mascot for the Nasty Burger and like get beat up by like kids and stuff, basically, because like she's poor. Like she lives in a shitty apartment and she's trying to save for college, and so she has like a job while trying to go to high school and also trying to fight ghosts. And Danny's giving her a hard time. Like, yeah, she's totally fair to like be like, dude, I don't actually have time to work on this project. And it's like the most like real like thing. Just like a regular person who has money problems and has to have a job while trying to go to high school, and on top of that, all that, trying to fight ghosts. So yeah, Danny kind of realizes that like as crazy as his life is, Valerie's might just be like a little bit worse. So yeah, he learns by the end of the episode to like, you know, give her a break. She's not all that bad, obviously, and he even offers to fill in for her at Nasty Burger. And Valerie also learns that like, okay, maybe the ghost boy isn't that bad because he helped her escape, as well as like made sure that the flower thing was protected. There's a B-plot with Tucker and Sam. Tucker starts to run this babysitting racket where like he charges other kids in the class that don't want to do the project to like take care of the sack of flour. And then Sam starts to worry that he might be neglecting their own sack of flour, so she starts taking care of it. And even though she initially thinks the project is stupid, she ends up kind of liking it and ends up taking care of their fake baby. But the subplot ends with Tucker's mom thinking that he brought home all this flour just so that she would have flour in the house, and so she ends up using all of it to bake like a shitload of cookies. And so Tucker has to refund all the other kids in his class. Pretty standard Tucker B-plot, but I think it's a really fun one, and I tend to like the ones where he does like a sort of money-making scheme. They're a little more fun, and he always gets his comeuppance in the end. It's a little nice, little satisfying B-plot. Again, yeah, all of the different stories come from the same initiating event. They have to do this assignment for whatever class they're in. I think it's health class. So yeah, this episode just has a really great balance of Danny's high school and social life as well as his ghostwriting life. We get a lot of great stuff with Valerie this episode, and some decent fun stuff with Skulker as the villain as well. There's a kind of fun moment towards the end when Danny realizes that he's kind of been a jerk to Valerie. So he does the thing that he does sometimes where like he'll say something essentially to the audience, and it's basically the show's version of like the Spider-Man narration, so we know like what Danny's thinking in certain situations. It's almost like winking at the camera and like an aside to the audience, like, man, I can't believe this is going on in my life. Can you believe it? It's like that kind of thing. So like towards the end of the episode, he's realizing he's kind of a jerk, and he just goes, man, and I thought I was supposed to be the good guy. And then Valerie's still in the room and she's like, what? And he's just like, nothing. And it's just this kind of funny moment where Valerie like acknowledges that he's just like randomly speaking out loud, like talking to the audience essentially, and she just doesn't understand what he's doing. And I find that funny. Yeah, I don't know what else to say. This is just a really, really strong episode. Great stuff with Valerie, great use of the characters. Really fun dynamics again, and yeah, like all the characters learn a lesson at the end, and it's all tied in a neat little bow, and it's just a good episode. Yeah, so that's about it. Thank you for watching, and tune in next time for more Danny Phantom. Welcome back to Danny Phantom Month. Today we are talking about episode 18, $1 Million Ghost. So Vlad is looking for this mysterious skeleton key that is said to be able to open any door in reality or whatever. But then he forgets to change his ectofiltration system. And so his ghost portal explodes and he's like, well, okay, who else has a ghost portal? Jack Fenton. Guess I'll go to his house and steal his. Meanwhile, at this point in the show, the town is much more aware that ghosts exist, and so the school is running ghost drills with Danny's parents, which of course embarrasses Danny. And then the town raises the stakes by bringing in all these world-renowned ghost hunters, which we find out later were actually paid by Vlad to come in to hunt Danny. There's a few different groups of different ghost hunters. We have the guys in white, who are obviously a Men in Black parody. We have this like motorcycle extreme motocross group that just like do extreme sports and also hunt ghosts. And then we have the Groovy Gang and Scaredy Cat, which is clearly a Scooby-Doo parody, but it's hilarious and great and I love it. There's lots of really fun Scooby-Doo parody moments with Scaredy Cat and it's great. So these ghost hunters are hunting Danny while also making Jack look like an idiot to distract Danny and Jack from their ghost portal, which Vlad is trying to steal. And that's the episode. I think this might be the first reappearance of Harriet Chin, who's a reporter. She first showed up in the first episode with Vlad, and Danny's parents went to college with her. But her career started to not do well once she started reporting ghosts, because she was around when ghosts happened. But I guess it's doing okay now because now the public knows that ghosts actually do exist. She might have actually been in the Walker episode. Well, I'll have to check that. But anyways, it's good to see that her career is back on track now that the public knows that ghosts exist. There's a whole plot device about how Danny keeps forgetting to do his chores. So, and one of his chores is changing the ectofiltration system on the ghost portal, so there's like a ticking clock. It's gonna explode if they don't change the filtration system in time, which will blow up their house and presumably kill whoever's in it. Jack kind of gets down on himself because he keeps failing to catch ghosts, but then him and Danny end up teaming up, Danny as a ghost, to work together to stop Vlad from stealing the ghost portal. And yeah, Jack kind of steals the show in the end of the episode, as although he's a fool and an idiot, when the chips are down, he is good at fighting ghosts. He actually ends up defeating Vlad in a fight, and it's kind of this cool moment for Danny where he's like, hey, my dad's actually kind of cool. That's so refreshing. Yeah, and they have a kind of nice bonding moment. Through that, they fix the portal and all that. This one feels like it could be sort of a season finale because it is a major confrontation with Vlad, the main villain. All the characters are in it. The town's perception of ghosts is distinctly changed from the beginning of the season. And Jack, like, fully steps up and defeats Vlad in a confrontation. So it's like this really strong bonding moment between Jack and Danny. In a normal show, this would be the season finale, but Danny Phantom is not a normal show, and so there's still one more episode after this, which we will get to tomorrow. A couple minor things. There's a B-plot with Tucker and Sam where Tucker's trying to run like a ghost tour of the city, which they use to distract the guys in white and the Groovy Gang and all the other ghost hunters. Almost all of the different Fenton gadgets that we've seen throughout the season reappear in this episode. Fishing rod, the boxing gloves, the vacuum cleaner. These are all gadgets. Jack uses them all at different points throughout the episode. Oh yeah, and then at the end of the episode, Vlad gets thrown back into the ghost portal, and he sort of comes closer to getting the skeleton key that he's been after, but then he gets eaten by a giant monster. What happens to Vlad after this? What does he need the skeleton key for? Those are questions that are resolved in season 2. So yeah, that's about it. Really strong episode, great use of all the characters. We get to see Vlad again in a fun way, interacting with Danny's family. This episode is a little lighter on the everyday problems of Danny. I mean, he's got like stuff with his family, which is pretty relatable, but not to the same extent as other episodes. Vlad Masters barely even shows up in this episode. It's basically just him as Plasmius. So I guess there's that element of duality that we don't really have in this one, as well as since we don't really know what Vlad's full plan or motivation is, he's not quite as compelling as he is in previous episodes. Yeah, I think that's about it. So yeah, really fun episode. I really love the guys in white, who of course show up again. We don't really ever get to see the Groovy Gang again. that I can think of, which is too bad because it's a really fun Scooby-Doo parody, and I think that's it. So yeah, tune in next time for more Danny Phantom. Happy Halloween, everybody, and welcome back to Danny Phantom Month. Today we are talking about episode 20, the final episode of season 1, which is titled Control Freaks. This is a fun, spooky episode. Nothing season finale-ish about it. It's pretty much a regular episode, but it's still fun, and there's a lot of great moments. The circus is in town. There's this goth circus called the Circus Gothica that Sam really wants to go to. It's got like, you know, a P.T. Barnum freak show, or oh, look at all the freaks, and ooh. It's like, ooh, your parents won't like this one. This episode is mostly focused on Sam. This is the first one where we get to see her parents, who are like the epitome of sunshine and rainbows. So it's like, yeah, okay, I understand why she's a goth. That makes sense. It's the exact opposite of her parents, so yeah, that checks out. And so her parents are really concerned because Sam wants to go to this gothic circus, and they think that her friends are a bad influence. So what's the plot of this one? So we find out that the guy who's leading the circus, his name is Freak Show, played by John Cryer, and he actually has this crystal ball that's been in his family for generations, and it allows him to control ghosts. And so the ghosts that he's controlling are the freaks in the Freak Show, and on the side he's also getting them to steal money and jewels and stuff with their ghost powers. Danny catches on to that, but he keeps getting framed by them, and so the police and the media are continue to be after the ghost kid Invisible. Just this great moment where they're like, freeze ghost kid, and then Danny leaves, and then the two cops are left with the jewels, and one of them's like, hey, we should take some and blame it on the ghost kid, and the other one's like, you're under arrest, and then the other guy just goes, aww. And it's this amazing like moment when they just make a joke about police corruption, but it's still lighthearted. It's really fun. The ghosts being controlled, they're all generic Freak Show ghosts. There's a midget one, there's a big one, there's one that has stretchy powers. The main one of note is called Lydia. I don't know if she's called that in this one or if that's a name given to her later, because she's the only one that actually comes back, mostly because she has the most interesting design and power set. She's this like very goth looking chick, and she has all these tattoos that like come alive and come off her body and like attack people. So yeah, just a really fun, spooky goth chick ghost. And yeah, she's the only one that comes back in future episodes. So Freak Show ends up controlling Danny. So now Danny's part of the circus. He's also helping these ghosts steal jewels and stuff. So the episode kind of shifts focus to be mostly about Sam. And so Sam has to figure out how to stop Freak Show and all that. And there's like a couple jokes about how like Tucker's like, hey, isn't it kind of ironic that your parents were right about the circus being evil? We get a couple fun moments with Sam's family. She has a nice moment with her grandma. We have seen in previous episodes, but in this one, she actually gets like a nice moment with Sam where she's like, you know what, like when I was your age, I had a rebellious side too. Like I get it, you have to go see your friends. It's fine. Feel free to sneak out, and her grandma lets her go, and it's kind of nice. Yeah, so then Sam eventually helps Danny to break free of the spell. I guess because he's part human, the spell doesn't work quite as well on him. As well as I think it's sort of implied that the other ghosts have been this mind control for literally years. He says that the crystal ball's been in his family for generations, so like, who knows how long that could be. And so Danny's only just gotten under the spell, so maybe it hasn't quite gotten a hold of him yet. Anyways, he's able to break free and then save the day. There's a fight on a train. Freak Show is captured by the police. They realize that he was behind all the robberies, and the other ghosts just kind of leave. Freak Show is interesting, of course, because he's one of the only human antagonists of the show. He doesn't have any powers. He just had this magic artifact that was in his family that allowed him to control ghosts. So yeah, he's still obviously related to ghosts, but not a ghost himself. We've had like other sort of human antagonists before, such as the guys in white or Valerie, but they're a little bit different because they're just ghost hunters. They're not like evil, where Freak Show is. A couple other things. This episode has another cross-dressing joke that you could not make today. There's a scene where Tucker dresses up as Sam to try to trick the teachers into thinking that Sam is not ditching school to go see the circus, and they say like, oh, this is so wrong, and it's like it's a thing. It wouldn't be that bad if it was just Tucker doing it, because it's like, all right, fair enough, you don't want to dress as a girl. I understand that. It's not for everyone. But then like one of the teachers says it as well, and it's like, ooh, that does not hold up today. Oh yeah, there's a great scene where Sam's parents are bringing her to see the principal because they're concerned about her. The principal says, oh, you know, some people say that, you know, acting out is a cry for attention, but I say that it's a cry for detention. just the most amazing thing. And such a like teacher, like parent thing to say, where like, instead of like addressing what might be troubling the kid, you just like immediately punish them. And it's like, yeah, that it does feel like that sometimes when you're a kid. There's this funny like ongoing joke where ditch school, they trap Lancer in like a storage closet, and then like every now and then it keeps cutting back to him and he's still there. There's like a part where like there's a news broadcast that's like, oh, so the circus in town today. In other news, Vice Principal Lancer has been missing for like over a day now. We don't know where he is. There's a Lancer book report of this episode, which is the cast of Monte Yaga, which I had to look up. It's like a book from another language or something. I don't know, I didn't know what it was. That's, I think, mostly it. So a fun episode, some cool, spooky, gothic stuff. So a decent one for Halloween. There's some fun satirical stuff with, like, Sam's family. How, like, bright and, like, conservative and colorful and happy that they are. Which is like, well, of course Sam is a goth. It makes, you know, that's just simple math. And there's some fun, like, satirical stuff about how, like, the circus is really evil and her friend is a ghost and is probably gonna get her into trouble. But at the end of the day, like, they are the heroes of the story.
I am the villain of the story.
Sort of an underwhelming season finale, but it's the last one of the season, so what are you gonna do? It's not a bad episode at all, but it's not, like, the best one of the season or anything like that. Yeah, so that concludes the vlog reviews of every episode of the first season of Danny Phantom. Here is my episode ranking. You can be angry at me in the comments now. Which episode is your favorite? Let me know. Yeah, so I hope you enjoyed this Danny Phantom month. I had a great time making these videos. Please subscribe if you want to see more content, and check out the rest of the videos. They're all out now. I hope you have had a happy Halloween, a spooky Spooktober, and a great Danny Phantom month. That about wraps things up, so see you next time with some other video. Boo!